Welcome, everyone. We're stepping into some truly uncharted territory for this deep dive today.
We really are.
Yeah, the source material we have on the table is, well, it's one of those rare texts that forces you to completely readjust your intellectual compass.
Oh, absolutely.
We are exploring a fascinating work titled, in Arabic, Hakada Takalam Confucius Al-Iman, which translates to Thus Spoke Confucius, Faith.
Right.
The author is the Iraqi philosopher Abdul Jabbar Al-Waily, and the text was published in Baghdad in 1975. And I'll be honest, when I first cracked this open, I was expecting, I don't know, a fairly straightforward translation or maybe an Eastern philosophical commentary.
Sure, yeah, based on the title.
Exactly. But what I found instead was this magnificent, culturally blended philosophical architecture that just completely caught me off guard.
It is a remarkable artifact of 20th century Middle Eastern philosophy.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to consider the sheer audacity of the framing device alone.
It's bold.
Very bold. The title itself, Thus Spoke Confucius, is a deliberate, heavy-handed nod to Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Right, Nietzsche's masterpiece.
Exactly. And where Nietzsche used the ancient Persian prophet Zarathustra as a literary mouthpiece to, announce the death of God and the dawn of the Übermensch Al-Waily, flips that exact script.
He turns it totally upside down.
He does. He uses the ancient Chinese sage, Confucius, as a vessel to fiercely defend the necessity of faith. He uses him to construct a rigid, logical defense of an eternal creator and to critique the very Western philosophical traditions that gave rise to Nietzsche in the first place.
That is the exact friction that hooked me right from the preface. You have this outer shell of ancient Chinese wisdom, but underneath, the engine driving the arguments is deeply rooted in profound Islamic theology and rigorous logical deductions.
It's an incredibly ambitious project.
It really is. He is attempting to map out the essence of human faith, the fundamental mechanics of the mind, and the architecture of the entire universe, all within a single volume.
Which is no small task.
No, not at all. But before we get swept away in the cosmic arguments, the text grounds us in a very specific physical space. The prologue isn't a dry academic introduction. It's incredibly cinematic.
Yeah, the setting is vital to understanding the tone of the philosophy that follows. Al-Waeli doesn't place Confucius in a grand imperial court or a bustling university.
Right.
He places him by the sacred shores. The text specifically highlights his deliberate escape from the noise, the chaos, and the relentless grinding machinery of the city.
It paints such a picture.
It does. He is sitting on the rocks,
Yeah.
and the auditory environment is reduced entirely to the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves and the quiet hum of his own internal thoughts.
When I was reading that passage, it struck me as a deliberate commentary on the prerequisites for actual philosophical inquiry. The text seems to suggest that the truth of the universe isn't something you can hear over the din of a marketplace.
No, it's too loud.
Right, or the endless chatter of daily life. You have to actively remove yourself, you have to seek the shore. And yet, he isn't entirely alone.
He has his disciple.
He does, but the way Al-Waili constructs the character of Confucius in this moment is so specific. He doesn't act like a booming, authoritative prophet shouting decrees from a mountaintop.
Far from it. The Confucius presented here is distinctly paternal, almost gentle.
Yeah.
The text explicitly describes him as a teacher who bestows wisdom without commanding it.
That's a great distinction.
It's a crucial distinction. In many religious or philosophical texts, the sage demands absolute obedience. Here, Confucius overlooks the faults of his disciples. Rather than scolding them for their ignorance or impatience, he focuses his energy entirely on planting seeds of beauty and goodness in their minds. He is a nurturing, patient observer of human nature.
It makes the wisdom feel accessible rather than intimidating. And Al-Waili makes a point in the prologue that I think is incredibly relevant to anyone listening to us right now.
Oh, definitely.
He states that he compiled these unrecorded sayings, these whispered thoughts shared over the sound of the crashing waves, so that people who couldn't be on that beach centuries ago could still be illuminated by them today.
He views this compilation as a way to push back the darkness of ignorance.
Exactly. So, in a very real sense, we are sitting on that shore right now. You, me, the listener. We are the recipients of those seeds of goodness.
It is a beautiful way to bridge the gap across time, culture, and language. He invites you to become a disciple sitting on those rocks.
Yeah.
But it is important to note that Al-Waili doesn't let you sit in that comfortable, quiet reflection for long. Once the scene is set, He abruptly shifts the scale of the conversation.
He really does step on the gas.
He plunges straight into the deepest, most foundational questions of existence, the very nature of mind and matter.
This was the first major gear shift in the text. He moves from a serene beach scene straight into what I can only describe as a masterclass in cosmic architecture.
That's a good way to put it.
The foundational argument he lays out is uncompromising. He asserts that the universe absolutely must have an eternal, willing creator, because matter, the physical stuff that makes up the rocks, the waves, our bodies cannot exist, and more importantly, cannot organize itself from absolute nothingness. The argument is rooted in classical cosmological deduction, but he introduces a specific terminology that drives the rest of his philosophy.
Right.
He posits the existence of what he calls the general mind, or in the Arabic text, al-am. Now, we have to be careful not to conflate this with some vague, New Age concept of universal energy.
No, it's very precise.
Incredibly precise. He defines this general mind as an active, conscious entity possessing 5 distinct, necessary mental faculties.
Right, and he lists them out very clearly: will, memory, deduction, perception, and imagination, which the text sometimes frames closer to intellect, depending on the translation nuances.
Yeah.
When I was looking at that list, I kept wondering why these 5 specifically.
Well, if you break down the mechanics of creation, any creation, whether it's a universe or a simple tool, those 5 faculties are the bare minimum requirements.
Okay, walk me through that.
First, there must be the will to create. Without desire or intention, the state of nothingness remains completely undisturbed.
Makes sense.
Second, memory is required to hold the concept of what is being created. Third, deduction allows the creator to understand the logical relationships between different elements, how gravity will affect mass, for instance.
Right, the physics engine.
Exactly. Fourth is perception, the ability to see and interact with the materials at hand. And finally, imagination or intellect, which is the capacity to design forms and systems that have never previously existed. Al-Waeli argues that matter possesses absolutely none of these.
Which brings us right to his argument about the dualism of mind and matter. I found his framing of this really fascinating because it echoes a lot of Western philosophy, but he arrives at his own distinct conclusion.
He points out a fundamental difference in their very nature.
Yeah. He describes matter as being extended. It takes up physical space, it has dimensions, height, width, depth, it is solid. The mind, on the other hand, is entirely non-extended.
Yes, that is classic Cartesian dualism. Descartes' distinction between res extensa, the extended thing, and res cogitans, the thinking thing. But Al-Waeli uses this distinction not just to explain human consciousness, but to prove the necessity of a pre-existing creator. His logic is that because mind and matter are fundamentally diametrically opposed in their core nature, it is a logical impossibility for mere matter, which is extended, lifeless, and blind, to spontaneously generate a non-extended perceptive thinking mind.
The lesser cannot generate the greater.
Exactly. The blind cannot generate sight. Therefore, the mind had to precede matter. The general mind had to exist before the physical universe could be organized.
I followed his logic there, but then he took a step that I genuinely wasn't expecting. He doesn't just leave it at God as a giant, non-extended mind sitting outside of the universe. He bridges the gap between the infinite and the finite in a way that almost sounds like pantheism.
You're touching on the core theological friction of the text here. It sounds like Spinoza's pantheism at first glance, the idea that God and the universe are one and the same.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Al-Waeli makes the bold claim that the general mind created what he calls partial minds, yuqul juzia, which are distributed across the entire infinite universe. According to the text, every single particle, every atom, every blade of grass, and every human being possesses some localized degree of this mind.
Let me test my understanding of this, because it is a dense concept. Is he arguing that the general mind is actually just the sum total of all these tiny partial minds combined, like a massive distributed computing network?
Okay, interesting analogy.
Like if you have billions of individual computers running localized programs, is the general mind just the collective network they create when connected?
That is a very modern analogy, but I would push back slightly on how you're framing the direction of the creation.
Okay, how so?
In a distributed network, the individual computers exist first, and the network is the byproduct of their connection. Al-Waeli's framework is top-down, not bottom-up. The general mind is eternal and pre-existing. It emanates or delegates these partial minds into matter to animate and organize it. He does say God is the universe and everything in it, but in the context of Islamic theology, which heavily influences his thought, this is closer to panentheism rather than strict pantheism.
Panentheism.
Yes. The universe is infused with the divine mind. It relies on it entirely, but the general mind still maintains a sovereign, overarching will that exceeds the mere sum of the universe's physical parts.
Okay, that distinction makes a lot of sense. The hardware of the universe doesn't generate the software. The eternal software is actively running the hardware from the smallest subatomic particle all the way up to human consciousness.
Precisely.
So the partial mind inside a rock just runs the basic physics engine, keeping the atoms together, while the partial mind inside a human is running the highly complex program of self-awareness. But they all stem from the exact same original source code.
That is exactly it. And Al-Waily argues that this is the only logically coherent way to explain how an infinite, non-extended creator can interact with finite, extended matter without being corrupted by it. The partial minds act as the interface.
Now, before we move into how this cosmic setup affects us on a human level, I want to do a quick impartiality check.
Good idea.
As we dive deeper into this, it is vital to remember that our goal here is to explore the author's philosophical framework. We are analyzing the internal logic of the universe he constructs in 1975 Baghdad.
Right.
Whether you, as a listener, lean towards strict atheistic materialism, traditional orthodox theology, or somewhere in between, there is immense value in mapping out how a thinker like Al-Waily constructs this elaborate architecture. We are looking at the blueprints of his philosophy purely to understand his perspective.
And understanding that cosmic blueprint is absolutely necessary for the next phase of his argument, because Al-Waily isn't interested in cosmic architecture just for the sake of abstract debate.
No, he's very grounded.
He is fundamentally a pragmatist when it comes to the human experience. Once he establishes that this general mind exists and permeates everything, he immediately pivots to ask, what does this mean for the individual? How does this knowledge help us survive the human condition?
Which brings us to a concept I found deeply compelling. He argues that faith isn't just a theoretical checkbox, it provides a psychological necessity.
Yes.
He uses a specific phrase, calling the result of true faith an optimistic tranquility.
Optimistic tranquility.
Yeah.
It is a striking juxtaposition of words.
It really is.
Tranquility implies a deep stillness and peace, while optimism implies a forward-looking act of hope. Al-Waily asserts that a true philosopher's faith, one that is deduced logically from observing the complexity of the universe rather than just blindly inherited, yields this specific state of mind.
So it's an active realization.
Exactly. You look at the mathematical precision of the stars, the biological complexity of a leaf, you deduce the general mind, and from that deduction, you attain a profound psychological peace.
And he doesn't just leave that as a vague naturalistic observation. He ties it directly into his own cultural and theological background. He brings up the Quran as the ultimate tangible proof of this divine complexity breaking through into human history.
Yes, he relies heavily on the Islamic concept of ijaz, or the inimitability of the Quran.
Right.
For Al-Waily, the Quran isn't just a holy book. It is a primary piece of evidence for his logical deduction. He points out that this text, which contains incredibly complex rhetoric, comprehensive legal codes, and profound wisdom, was delivered by the Prophet Muhammad, an unlettered orphan living in an ancient, harsh desert environment.
His argument is essentially that the output dramatically exceeds the input, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the historical and material conditions of 7th century Arabia, the production of a text with that level of structural and linguistic perfection just shouldn't be logically possible. Therefore, he sees it as an undeniable footprint of the general mind interacting with a localized human mind.
That's his precise deduction. He uses the historical miracle of the text to validate the philosophical deduction of the creator. But he quickly shifts from the historical proof back to the personal, psychological reality of the listener.
He brings it right back home.
He does. He addresses something that every single human being has to confront, the absolute inevitability of hardship.
This was the most emotionally resonant part of the text for me. He doesn't sugarcoat the human experience at all.
No, he doesn't.
He states plainly that life, no matter how long it stretches, has a definitive end. And no matter how privileged, pure, or protected your life might be, it will eventually be clouded by severe distress, failure, and pain. It's a very sober view of existence.
It is deeply realistic. He understands that a philosophy that only works when things are going well is entirely useless.
Right. It's easy to be a philosopher on a sunny day.
Exactly. The true test of any belief system is how it processes suffering. And Al-Waily introduces a perspective on suffering that is remarkably challenging. The text contains a line that serves as the thesis for this entire section. Every disaster benefits you if it doesn't destroy you.
I had to read that line 3 times. Every disaster benefits you if it doesn't destroy you. It sounds a bit like the old Nietzschean cliche, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, but Al-Waili's version feels fundamentally different in its intent.
It is different.
It doesn't feel like it's about building a callous, hardened ego.
You're right to distinguish the two. Nietzsche's formulation is about power and resilience in a chaotic, meaningless world. Al-Waili's formulation is teleological, meaning it is about a grand design and an ultimate purpose.
Right.
He suggests that hardships are not instances of random cruelty from a cold universe. Instead, they serve a vital refining function. He relies on a brilliant agricultural metaphor to explain this. He compares the human soul to raw, bitter fruit.
I loved this metaphor. It says that the intense, unforgiving heat of the sun is absolutely required to ripen that fruit.
Yes.
If you protect the fruit from the sun, it might look pristine, but it remains hard, bitter, and entirely inedible.
Precisely. Hardships, the disasters, the failures, the heartbreaks, are the sun's heat. They refine our raw feelings and mature our lost souls. Without the intense heat of suffering, the human soul remains fundamentally immature.
Wow.
The optimistic tranquility he mentioned earlier doesn't mean you smile happily while you are suffering. It means you possess the deep underlying assurance that the suffering has an architecture, a purpose, and an ultimate endpoint.
I think about how this applies to modern coping mechanisms. When someone goes through a catastrophic life event, say an unexpected divorce, the sudden loss of a career, or a severe health crisis, the immediate reaction is usually a profound sense of meaninglessness.
Yes, the why is this happening to me phase.
Exactly. Al-Waili is saying that if you have faith in a perfect, merciful general mind, you possess a framework that actively transforms that meaningless agony into a necessary temporary ripening process. You aren't just enduring pain, you are being prepared for an eternal peace.
And if we look at the alternative he presents, it is incredibly stark.
It really is bleak.
If you remove that framework of faith, if you assume the universe is just blind matter crashing into blind matter, then all of your suffering is just random static. It serves zero purpose. Life, in that view, is just an accumulation of painful stimuli leading to what he explicitly calls absolute nothingness.
It is the ultimate pragmatic argument for faith. Even if you struggle to follow the dense cosmological logic about extended and non-extended matter, his point here is that you need this belief system simply to survive the psychological meat grinder of human existence.
Exactly.
Without the optimistic tranquility, the chaotic dread of the world will completely consume you.
It is a powerful argument for the utility of belief. However, Al-Waili is far too sharp a thinker to leave it at mere theoretical belief.
Right, he knows humans too well.
He recognizes a fundamental human flaw. We are incredibly forgetful creatures. A profound realization you have on a Tuesday can be completely forgotten by Thursday when you're stuck in traffic or dealing with a crisis.
Oh, absolutely.
So how do you maintain that optimistic tranquility? This leads to his critical exploration of essence versus ritual.
This part of the text fascinated me because it completely reframes how we think about religious practice and, honestly, even secular habits.
Yeah.
He creates this very sharp, definitive boundary between faith, which he defines as the core essence, and rituals, which he refers to as the symptoms or the physical manifestations of that faith.
He argues that the relationship between the two is symbiotic but hierarchical. The essence is the core truth, but essence without ritual is highly vulnerable.
How does he frame that vulnerability?
He posits that faith without continuous physical rituals is like a fire deprived of oxygen. I might burn brightly for a moment after a profound realization, but it will inevitably flicker out as the demands of physical life suffocate it.
That makes a lot of sense.
The rituals are the necessary mechanism designed to constantly sharpen the faith, keeping the connection to the general mind active in the forefront of human consciousness.
To illustrate this, the text pulls a very specific quote from the Quran. It cites Surah Al-Ankabut, verse 45, which states, "Indeed, prayer prohibits immorality and wrongdoing."
Yes.
When I first read that, I thought of it as just a standard religious directive. But the way Al-Waili unpacks the psychology behind it is actually incredibly profound.
He is dissecting the sociology of morality. Why does a society need its citizens to pray? From a purely functional standpoint, Al-Waili argues that a morality based entirely on the fear of worldly consequences is incredibly fragile.
Oh, totally.
Think about it. If your only reason for not stealing or lying is that you are afraid the police will catch you or that your reputation will be ruined on social media, your morality is entirely conditional.
Right. It relies on the presence of an observer. If you are reasonably certain that the security cameras are turned off, or if you attain enough wealth and power that the laws no longer apply to you in the same way, that worldly deterrent just evaporates. The conditional morality collapses.
Exactly. But Al-Waeli contrasts this with the morality generated by true faith that is sharpened by daily ritual. The ritual of prayer ingrains the constant, unbroken awareness of an all-seeing general mind.
The panopticon.
Yes, it establishes a permanent moral safeguard. It internalizes the panopticon. You do the right thing not because society is watching, but because the ultimate reality is watching. The ritual physically reminds the body of the essence, and the essence dictates the ethical behavior.
But he is also brutally critical of the exact opposite scenario. He issues a severe warning about what happens when you perform the rituals entirely divorced from the essence.
This is a major point for him.
He points out that it is incredibly common for people to practice rituals purely out of mechanical cultural habit.
This is where his critique cuts across both religious and secular boundaries. If an individual merely goes through the physical motions of a ritual, standing, bowing, reciting words, without any internal cognitive or emotional engagement with the divine, the ritual is dead.
It's just choreography.
Exactly. It becomes an empty pantomime.
He uses a phrase that really stuck with me. He says that for a person, you have people waking up at 5 a.m. to do 10 minutes of journaling, 20 minutes of mindfulness meditation, followed by a cold plunge. But if you look at the behavioral psychology behind it, if they are just doing it mechanically to check boxes on a habit tracker app, if they have completely forgotten the core why or the essence of seeking stillness, it is completely useless.
It is the exact phenomenon Al-Waeli is describing. You can sit in the meditative posture for 30 minutes, but if your internal monologue is just aggressively planning your workday or replaying an argument you had yesterday, you haven't cultivated any actual mindfulness.
Not at all.
When a severe stressor hits you later that afternoon, that empty morning ritual will not protect you from losing your temper or making a poor ethical decision. The mechanics of practice demand absolute unity between the physical action and the internal intention.
Which naturally leads to one of the most intellectually thrilling sections of the entire text. Because while Al-Waeli demands that intention must guide the action, he vehemently rejects the idea that simply knowing the right intention is enough to guarantee that you will actually perform the good action.
This is where things get really combative.
Yeah. This brings us to a massive philosophical collision. We are looking at the argument of action over intellect.
This is where Al-Waeli directly engages with classical Western philosophy. He sets his sights on Socrates.
Heavy hitter.
This is a profound moment in the text because he is challenging one of the most foundational concepts of Western ethical thought, Socratic intellectualism.
In the reading, he zeroes in on the famous Socratic paradox. To summarize it broadly for you listening, Socrates argued that knowing virtue leads to virtue. In the Socratic framework, no human being willingly or knowingly does wrong. If someone commits an evil act or harms themselves or others, Socrates argued that it is strictly a result of ignorance. If that person had truly deeply understood what the good was, their rational, calculating mind would have automatically compelled them to choose the good.
It is a highly rationalist view of human nature. It assumes the intellect is the absolute sovereign over human behavior. If the mind knows the truth, the body will obey.
But Al-Waeli disagrees.
Strongly. Al-Waeli examines this Socratic premise and unequivocally rejects it. He argues that Socrates fundamentally misunderstood the role of the intellect in the human machine.
He says the rational mind is merely a diagnostic tool.
Yes.
It is an instrument of differentiation. It can look at a complex moral dilemma, analyze the variables, and say, okay, path A is virtuous and will lead to flourishing, while path B is destructive and will lead to suffering.
It maps the terrain.
The intellect is perfectly capable of drawing the map. But, and this is the crux of his argument, the map is not the engine. Intellect alone has absolutely no horsepower to drive the vehicle.
Al-Waeli posits that it is our emotions that serve as the actual engine of human action. And he takes a very realistic, somewhat stark view of our emotional baseline.
He's very clear-eyed about it.
He notes that human beings are deeply susceptible to negative emotions: greed, lust, anger, pride, envy. These emotions are not passive. They are incredibly loud, active, and forceful. They demand immediate satisfaction.
This makes so much sense when you look at actual human behavior rather than just abstract philosophy. If Socrates were right, the world would look entirely different.
Absolutely.
Think about modern behavioral economics or addiction psychology. Every single person who smokes a cigarette today is acutely aware that it causes lung cancer. The rational mind has perfectly differentiated the healthy choice from the unhealthy choice.
The diagnostic tool works.
The diagnostic tool has done its job flawlessly, so why do they still light up?
Because, as Al-Waili would argue, the immediate overwhelming emotional and physiological desire for nicotine relief utterly eclipses the cold, distant, rational knowledge of long-term health consequences.
The emotion overrides the intellect.
Completely. The intellect is shouting a warning, but the emotional engine is already driving the car off the cliff. Socrates would argue the smoker just doesn't truly comprehend the risk. Al-Waili argues they understand it perfectly, they simply lack the emotional horsepower to act on that knowledge.
This concept is incredibly similar to the metaphor used by the modern psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who describes the mind as an elephant and a rider.
That's a perfect parallel.
The rider is the rational intellect. It can see the path and try to steer. But the elephant represents our deep, emotional, intuitive drives. If the elephant wants to go left and the rider wants to go right, the elephant is going to win every single time because it has all the mass and the power.
That is a brilliant modern parallel to Al-Waili's argument from 1975. The intellect, the rider, needs the backing of equally strong, positive emotions to have any hope of directing the elephant.
It needs backup.
Exactly. If the rational mind is not supported by a deep, burning emotional love for the creator or a passionate, almost physical revulsion toward injustice, the negative emotions will always overpower the cold calculations of reason.
Which leads Al-Waili to a definitive conclusion. Doing good is inherently, fundamentally superior to simply knowing what is good.
Yes.
A philosopher who sits in a room perfectly defining virtue but does nothing is inferior to the simple person who perhaps cannot articulate the definition of virtue but actively helps their neighbor. Knowledge without action is an aborted process.
However, Al-Waili is also very pragmatic about how difficult it is to actually align the action with the knowledge. Since these negative emotions are so powerful, how is an individual supposed to consistently defeat them?
Right, what's the strategy?
He acknowledges a level of biological reality here. He admits that we cannot easily control our genetics. Some people are simply born with a hotter temper, a higher propensity for addiction, or a deeper susceptibility to anxiety.
He doesn't just say, well, try harder.
No, he doesn't.
He introduces the concept of environmental scaffolding. He says that achieving moral perfection or even just basic decency is nearly impossible in isolation. We are profoundly dependent on what he calls a good environment.
And he lays out a very specific sociological recipe for this environment. He states that constructing this moral scaffolding requires the combined, coordinated efforts of individuals, religious institutions, schools, and fair governments.
It is a deeply systemic view of morality.
It is.
I found that list so revealing. It breaks the mold of hyper-individualistic philosophy. He is essentially arguing that a fair, just government and a good educational system are prerequisites for widespread individual morality.
They set the baseline.
If the government is corrupt or the schools are failing, you are starving the positive emotions of the population. You are giving the negative emotions an overwhelming advantage. Society has to build the environment that gives the rational intellect the emotional backup it needs to win.
It is a remarkable synthesis of individual responsibility and collective societal obligation. And this recognition of human limitation, the reality that our pure intellect is frail and easily overpowered, serves as the perfect transition into the most combative, aggressive section of the entire text.
Yeah, this is where it escalates.
Because if human intellect is this limited, then making absolute claims about the infinite universe is the height of folly.
You are talking about the section where the gloves finally come off. We are diving into his critique of the arrogance of atheism, and specifically his dissection of the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer.
Al-Waili builds a devastating logical critique against absolute atheism. His argument is rooted in the sheer disparity of scale between the human mind and the cosmos.
Right.
He states that the human intellect is demonstrably finite, localized, and highly limited in its perceptive capabilities. We can only see a tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. We occupy an infinitesimal speck of space, and our history is barely a blink in cosmic time.
Right. And his logic is that the universe contains infinite, staggering secrets. To categorically state, there is no creator, is not merely a statement of personal disbelief. It is an absolute, universal truth claim.
It's a huge claim.
Massive. To accurately make that claim, you would have to possess absolute, exhaustive knowledge of every single dimension, every physical law, and every corner of the infinite universe to ensure the creator wasn't hiding somewhere you hadn't looked.
which, of course, no human being possesses. Therefore, Al-Waily argues, the absolute denial of a creator is not rooted in science or logic. It is a logical fallacy born entirely of extreme intellectual arrogance. It is the finite attempting to dictate terms to the infinite.
But he doesn't just attack the logical structure of atheism. He attacks the practical, lived results of it. He wants to show the reader exactly where that specific intellectual path leads. And to do that, he points directly to Arthur Schopenhauer.
Schopenhauer is a fascinating, polarizing figure in Western philosophy, famous for his deep, uncompromising pessimism.
Ultimate pessimism.
Truly, he viewed the foundational reality of the universe not as a rational, benevolent general mind, but as a blind, striving, irrational will. For Schopenhauer, this will constantly drives humans to desire things, but the moment we get what we desire, we fall into boredom, and then the cycle of painful striving begins again.
Al-Waily holds Schopenhauer up as the ultimate cautionary tale. He essentially tells the reader, look closely at this man. If you rigorously follow the logic of a meaningless, creatorless universe to its absolute final conclusion, this is where you end up.
Yes.
The text details how Schopenhauer looked at human existence and concluded it was a tragic farce. It was a mistake that should never have happened.
Schopenhauer lived that philosophy. Al-Waily highlights how Schopenhauer actively advocated against marriage and against bringing new human life into the world, viewing procreation as just feeding more victims to the meat grinder of the blind will.
It's incredibly dark.
He preached a philosophy of ultimate resignation, of surrendering to annihilation to escape the suffering.
It is the absolute polar opposite of the optimistic tranquility we discussed earlier. It is pure, paralyzing despair. Al-Waily uses this to prove that a universe without the general mind isn't a realm of ultimate intellectual freedom. It is a prison of unbearable nihilism.
Yet, even in the midst of this harsh critique, Al-Waily introduces a very subtle, important categorization. He does not paint all non-believers with the same brush. He delineates two distinctly different types of disbelief, which reveals a lot about his philosophical empathy.
Yes, I noticed that. He separates them into what he calls honest scientific disbelief and intentional disbelief.
For the first category, honest scientific disbelief, he actually extends a degree of grace. This describes an individual who is genuinely seeking the truth, who utilizes rigorous scientific methodology, but simply has not yet encountered the specific evidence or the internal paradigm shift required to convince them of the general mind.
He respects the process.
He does. Al-Waily states that this person has some excuse. Their intent is pure. Their methodology is just currently incomplete.
But he has zero patience for the second category, intentional disbelief. He refers to this as the worst evil.
He pulls no punches there.
None. This isn't a lack of belief due to missing evidence. It is a willful, deliberate blindness. It is disbelief driven by the ego, the desire to appear intellectually superior, to be edgy, to be a contrarian just for the sake of it. It is a refusal to submit to the cosmic architecture, not out of logic, but out of pride.
To contextualize this sociologically, Al-Waily brings in a brilliant reference to Sir Francis Bacon, one of the foundational figures of the scientific revolution. Bacon famously observed that a little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion.
That quote is the linchpin of Al-Waily's sociological observation here. He notes that this intentional, arrogant atheism is incredibly rampant among what he categorizes as half-educated intellectuals.
Half-educated?
Right. These are individuals who have learned just enough to deconstruct the simple childhood stories of religion, but they haven't dug deeply enough to encounter the terrifying, awe-inspiring complexity of actual reality.
It is essentially the Dunning-Kruger effect applied to theology and cosmology. They are perched on the first peak of Mount Stupid, believing they have figured out the entire universe because they read a few skeptical essays.
Exactly, and he masterfully contrasts this arrogant middle ground with two entirely different groups of people who reside on opposite ends of the educational spectrum, yet both arrive at profound faith.
That's a beautiful contrast.
On one end, he points to the simple, uneducated old woman. She hasn't read Descartes or Spinoza, but she possesses an unshakable, pure faith derived entirely from a lifetime of experiencing that necessary optimistic tranquility. She has survived the harsh sun ripening the fruit, and she knows intimately that the faith works.
And on the far opposite end of the spectrum, you have the most brilliant top-tier minds in human history. The quantum physicists, the astronomers, the elite mathematicians.
The people studying the actual architecture.
Yes. These individuals also arrive at a profound sense of faith or awe, not through simple experiential peace, but because their rigorous study has brought them face to face with the staggering, infinite complexity and mathematical perfection of the cosmos.
The deeper they dive into the quantum realm or the expansion of the galaxies, the more they realize that a localized, accidental materialism cannot possibly account for the architecture they are observing. So the absolute pinnacle of human intellect and the absolute baseline of simple human endurance both find their way to faith.
Yes.
It is only the arrogant, half-educated middle that gets trapped in the illusion of atheism.
It is a devastatingly effective rhetorical mapping of the intellectual landscape. And once again, serving as our impartiality check, we are unpacking the specific psychological and sociological warfare Al-Waily is deploying here. Theological philosophy does not merely play defense against secular critique. In the hands of a thinker like Al-Waily, it goes on the offensive, dissecting the psychological roots of its detractors.
I completely agree. Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, the thoroughness of his attack is undeniably impressive. But what really elevates this text from a mere polemic to a work of deep philosophical maturity is what happens next.
The final turn.
After thoroughly dismantling the logic of atheism, he doesn't just abandon the honest doubter. He recognizes that there are people trapped in that honest scientific disbelief who genuinely cannot force themselves to believe. For them, he offers a remarkably nuanced path forward.
This is perhaps the most intellectually generous and surprising section of the entire book. Al-Waily concludes that if a person is truly rational, incredibly sincere in their search, and yet still cannot find the definitive proof of the faith we've been discussing, the absolute furthest they can logically go is to adopt the position of la adri.
La adri, it literally translates from Arabic as, I don't know. It is the exact, precise definition of agnosticism.
He argues that while honest atheism is a logical impossibility due to the absolute knowledge it requires, honest agnosticism is an intellectually valid, defensible position. And to explain the mechanics of this agnostic position, he introduces what I consider to be the most brilliant metaphor in the entire text. It is the metaphor of the ocean.
This metaphor is stunning. I want you listening to genuinely visualize this. Picture the Pacific Ocean. It is impossibly vast, unfathomably deep, pitch black in its lowest trenches, and the vast majority of it is entirely unexplored by human beings.
Al-Waily asks you to imagine that you are a researcher looking for a specific piece of evidence, let's say a golden coin. You dive into the ocean, but because of your limited oxygen and equipment, you can only search a tiny, quiet, localized corner of a coral reef. You search a few cubic feet of water thoroughly, and you do not find the gold coin.
Now, if you swim back to the surface, climb onto your boat, and loudly declare to the world, I have searched the water, and I can say with absolute certainty that there are no gold coins anywhere in the entire ocean, you are being completely absurd. Your conclusion vastly outstrips your data. You cannot logically claim that something doesn't exist in the vast, unsearched, infinite depths simply because you failed to find it in your tiny, localized, 3-foot search radius.
It is the ultimate lesson in intellectual humility. The metaphor maps perfectly onto the human search for the general mind. Just because we, operating with our tiny, finite human brains, standing on our tiny blue rock floating in an infinite expanse of space, haven't found the specific, undeniable, empirical proof of the Creator within our microscopic corner of existence, does not mean that proof is absent from the universe.
The only scientifically and logically sound response when you surface from that dive is, I haven't found it yet, I don't know. The La Adri.
However, Al-Waily does not let the agnostic retreat into passive apathy. He introduces a critical caveat. He argues that true, honest agnosticism inherently contains what he terms a partial faith.
Because if you admit that you don't know, you are simultaneously admitting that the existence of the Creator is possible. The gold coin might actually be down there. And if it is possible, your behavior must account for that possibility.
Exactly. And this leads to his final, deeply pragmatic directive, the concept of maintaining a line of return, or in Arabic, cut al-raja. Al-Waily asserts that even if your mind is plagued by insurmountable agnostic doubt, you are still morally obligated to adhere to beneficial societal rituals and ethics.
You still have to act with kindness. You still have to participate in the communal good, strive for justice, and avoid immorality. Why? Because you might be wrong about your doubts.
Exactly.
If you die and you discover that the general mind does indeed exist, but you lived a life of cruel, selfish nihilism because you weren't sure, you have entirely doomed yourself. But if you live a highly moral, virtuous life despite your doubts, you have kept your line of return open. You haven't burned the bridge back to the Creator.
It bears a strong structural resemblance to Pascal's wager. The idea that betting on God's existence is the safest mathematical bet. But Al-Waily's version is far less cynical. Pascal's wager often feels like a selfish bet to avoid hellfire. Al-Waily's Qat al-Raja is rooted in societal participation and moral duty.
It's much more communitarian.
It is. He is saying that in the face of absolute cosmic uncertainty, the wisest, most logical, and most beneficial choice for both yourself and your community is to practice the rituals of goodness.
It all ties perfectly back into his argument against Socrates. The intellect won't be stuck at, I don't know, but the actions can still be virtuous. The action is what ultimately matters.
It is a remarkable synthesis. He manages to champion deep dogmatic faith while simultaneously carving out an honorable moral space for the intellectually humble skeptic.
This text has been an absolute revelation. Let's look back at the sheer ground we've covered today, tracing the brilliant architecture of Abdul Jabbar Al-Waeli's mind from 1975 Baghdad. We started by sitting on that quiet beach with Confucius, escaping the noise to let the seeds of wisdom be planted. We scaled all the way up to the cosmic level, exploring how the eternal general mind delegates partial minds to animate the lifeless, extended matter of the universe.
We examined the profound psychological necessity of faith, that optimistic tranquility required to endure the harsh sun of human suffering, which ultimately ripens the soul. We dissected the vital mechanics of practice, recognizing that while rituals without a core essence are hollow and dangerous, essence without the repetition of ritual will simply suffocate and die.
We watched him absolutely deconstruct the Socratic paradox, proving through the reality of human behavior that our loud, powerful emotions are the true engines of our actions, and that our rational intellect requires a rigorously constructed moral environment to stand any chance of guiding us. We witnessed his fierce, uncompromising critique of the extreme arrogance required to maintain absolute atheism, using Schopenhauer's tragic pessimism as the ultimate warning sign.
Then finally, we sailed out onto that vast, unexplored ocean of agnosticism. We learned that true logic demands profound humility regarding what we cannot see, and that practical wisdom demands we keep our line of return open by stubbornly practicing the rituals of goodness, even when the mind is clouded by doubt.
It is an absolute masterpiece of philosophical synthesis. It challenges both the rigid dogmatist and the arrogant skeptic.
It does. And as we conclude, I want to leave you with a lingering thought, a thread to pull on based on that final brilliant concept. Al-Waily talks extensively about keeping that line of return open through your actions, especially when your intellect is failing to provide certainty.
A great point to reflect on.
So I ask you, in your own life, whether it is within your career trajectory, the complexities of your personal relationships, or your deepest existential and philosophical beliefs, when you feel completely at sea, when you're entirely overwhelmed by the Laadri, what are the specific rituals of goodness you rely on to keep your own line of return open?
That is the ultimate question to take with you. Think about those rituals. Think about your ocean. Thank you for taking this profound journey with us into the mind of Al-Waeli and thus spoke Confucius. It has been an absolute privilege. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and we will catch you next time.